A photograph sits in an evidence locker at the NYPD 32nd Precinct. It was taken by a newspaper photographer who happened to be at Wells that night. The photo shows Bumpy Johnson sitting across from a white woman. Not just any woman. Helen Lawson, senior editor at Vanity Fair magazine. Their hands are nearly touching across the table. The intensity in their eyes would be unmistakable to anyone who understood what they were looking at. The photograph was never published. It was buried. Not because it was scandalous. Plenty of scandalous photographs existed in Harlem in 1948. It was buried because everyone who saw it understood something fundamental. This woman, this white woman from Manhattan's literary elite, represented something no bullet could ever represent. She represented power. Not the kind of power that ends conversations. The kind that controls them. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most dangerous man, found his most dangerous weapon. Not in the barrel of a gun. In the mind of a woman he met at a jazz club who could do something no gangster, no enforcer, no lieutenant could do. She could make the world listen. The club wasn't fancy. Red leather booths, a small bar, a stage where local musicians performed. The crowd was mixed, hustlers, working people, musicians, intellectuals. The kind of place where a woman like Helen Lawson would come if she was looking for authenticity. Helen was 31 years old. Harvard-educated mother. Father was a diplomat. She'd gone to Vassar, published articles in the New Yorker, reviewed films for Vanity Fair, moved in circles where people like Truman Capote and Carson McCullers were dinner guests. She was intelligent, beautiful in an understated way, and dangerously curious about worlds her background never allowed her to enter. She was at Smalls that night because Vanity Fair had assigned her a piece about Harlem's Renaissance, what remained of it in 1948, anyway. The golden age was over. The Depression had killed it. But something remained. A cultural energy. A defiance. She sat at a small table near the bar, nursing a gin and tonic, notebook open, watching. Observing. Trying to understand how a community survived when the entire system was designed to crush it. That's when she noticed him. Not because he was the most obvious person in the room. Quite the opposite. Bumpy Johnson never drew attention to himself. He was 42 years old that summer, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, fedora placed precisely on the small table beside him. He wasn't large. Not imposing in the way that makes people automatically afraid. But something about the way people moved around him. The way conversations shifted when he glanced in a direction. The way the bartender brought him a drink without being asked. The way even the musicians seemed to be performing for him, even though he never looked directly at the stage. Helen made a note, asterisk, there's a man here who owns this room without owning it. Asterisk. An hour passed. She watched him. He hadn't looked at her once. That was deliberate. She could tell. A man who owned a room didn't accidentally avoid noticing things. Finally, she did something that violated every protocol her family had instilled in her. She stood up. She walked across the room. She sat down across from him. I know you, she said. Not a question. A statement. Bumpy looked up slowly. His eyes were dark, calculating, the eyes of a man accustomed to measuring threats. You don't, he said quietly. No, I do. Or rather, I know of you. Ellsworth Johnson. They call you Bumpy. You run the numbers operation in Harlem. You work for Stephanie St. Clair. You've been arrested 27 times and never convicted of anything serious. You study Shakespeare in your spare time. You donate money to the church on 130th Street anonymously. You have a wife, Mamie, who you've been faithful to for 8 years, which is unusual in your line of work. Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man watching someone play a game he already understood. You're a reporter, he said. Writer. And researcher. I work for Vanity Fair. I'm doing a piece on Harlem's cultural persistence in the post-Renaissance era. Vanity Fair, Bumpy repeated. He leaned back slightly. That's white magazine for rich white people who want to feel like they understand culture. Helen didn't flinch. That's an accurate assessment. But I'm also a woman who reads Shakespeare, understands that Harlem isn't a monolith, and knows enough to recognize someone intelligent when she sits across from them. Which is rare in my experience. For the first time, Bumpy's expression shifted. Not a smile. Something subtler. Recognition. You want to interview me, he said. No, Helen replied. I want to understand you. There's a difference. This was the moment that changed everything. Not because Helen and Bumpy fell in love. Not because of romance or passion. But because Helen Lawson, in that single conversation, understood something about Bumpy Johnson that no one else in Harlem had fully grasped. He was lonely. Not physically lonely. He was surrounded by people constantly, lieutenants, runners, collectors, police officers on his payroll, politicians seeking his favor. He was never alone. But he was intellectually isolated. He was a man who read Shakespeare, who understood systems, who saw several moves ahead of everyone around him. And the people around him, even those closest to him, couldn't meet him on that level. Helen could. They met every Friday night at different restaurants. Never the same place twice. Helen would suggest locations: a small Italian place on 131st Street, a Chinese restaurant on Lenox, a Puerto Rican diner on 125th. Never anywhere too public. Never anywhere that would draw attention. Their conversations ranged across everything. Literature. Power systems. Harlem's history. The numbers game and how it functioned. The police. The Italians. Bumpy's philosophy of respect. Helen had a gift for asking the right questions. Not questions that sought information she could use against him. Questions that forced him to articulate his thinking. Why do you insist on respect? She asked one night, over coffee. Because without it, you're just another thug with a gun, Bumpy replied. And thugs don't last. But men with respect? They build empires that survive them. Even if they're criminals. Especially if they're criminals. A legitimate businessman can fail because his company fails. A criminal's entire structure is built on something intangible. Trust. That trust is only as solid as the respect people have for him. Lose the respect, the entire system collapses. Helen wrote nothing down. She never took notes when she was with Bumpy. But she remembered everything. Over those 3 months, something shifted. Helen began to understand Bumpy not as a subject for an article, but as a person. And Bumpy began to understand Helen as something he'd never had before, an equal. An intellectual peer. Someone who didn't need him for protection or money. Someone who was interested in him because of who he was, not what he controlled. It was unprecedented in his world. But more importantly, it was strategically devastating to anyone who opposed him. Because Helen Lawson had access to something no gangster, no matter how wealthy, could easily access. The machinery of legitimate power. The situation everyone knew was coming finally arrived. Saw Bonanno, nephew of Joe Bonanno, the most powerful mafia boss in New York, walked into Wells' restaurant with 6 armed men. The same incident referenced earlier, the racial slur, the 6-word response, the standoff. But here's what the traditional accounts left out. When Bumpy told Saw Bonanno that he had 40 soldiers in that restaurant, people who owed him loyalty not because of fear, but because of genuine respect, he was partially bluffing. The 40 people were real. Their loyalty was real. But they weren't all armed soldiers. Many were businesspeople. Teachers. Mothers. People whose primary loyalty was to the community Bumpy had protected. That night, after Saw Banano left, after the 5 families called their emergency meeting, something happened that no historian documented. Helen Lawson received a phone call. "I need you to write something," Bumpy said quietly. "About what?" "About what just happened. About why an Italian mobster came into a black neighborhood and was forced to leave empty-handed." Helen understood immediately what he was asking. "You want me to publish this?" "I want the right people to read it. In the right publication. I want them to understand that Harlem isn't for sale because Harlem has something the Italians can't control. Community. Actual social structure. Not just muscle." Helen wrote the piece. She didn't publish it under her own byline. She couldn't. It would destroy her credibility at Vanity Fair, and her career. Instead, she shopped it to a friendly editor at the New York Times. A friend of hers who owed her a favor. The article ran in the Times Sunday edition. Not on the front page. But it was there. A thoughtful analysis of how organized crime functioned differently in black neighborhoods precisely because legitimate power structures had never allowed black mobsters to build the same kind of institutional legitimacy. The piece didn't name Bumpy. It didn't mention the incident at Wells. But anyone in the mob world who read it understood exactly what it meant. It meant Bumpy Johnson had access to legitimate press. It meant his story could reach beyond the streets. It meant he wasn't isolated to the criminal underworld, he was connected to the legitimate world as well. For the first time, the Italian Mafia understood they weren't just fighting a street gangster. They were fighting a man who could shape narratives. Over the next 2 years, Helen became Bumpy's quiet advisor. Not in any official capacity. She never went to his office. Never attended meetings. Never wore a title or received a salary. But she understood the architecture of power in ways that went far beyond the street. When Bumpy needed to negotiate with Lucky Luciano, it was Helen who suggested the strategy. Not the specific tactics, but the underlying principle. "You have to make them understand that you're not just a gangster," she told him. "You're a representative of a community they can't ignore. Your value isn't just the money you control. It's the legitimacy you've built." When Frank Costello began exploring ways to move into Harlem, it was Helen who predicted exactly how it would happen, what pressure points the Italians would use, and what counterpressure would be most effective. She never told Bumpy what to do. Instead, she helped him see the game at a level above the immediate tactical situation. More importantly, her connection to legitimate media became a subtle but constant presence. Articles about Harlem's economic conditions appeared in respectable publications. Profiles of its cultural significance. Essays about the dangers of organized crime encroachment. None of them mentioned Bumpy directly. But all of them subtly reinforced the narrative that Harlem was something worth protecting, that its destruction would have costs that extended far beyond the criminal underworld. Journalists began looking more carefully at police corruption in Harlem. Prosecutors started asking harder questions about why certain investigations went nowhere. Politicians realized that any major violent incident in Harlem would be scrutinized intensely by the legitimate press. All of this created a protective sphere around Bumpy's operation. The Italians couldn't move against him without risking significant negative publicity. Any attempt to take over Harlem would be documented, analyzed, questioned. The narrative wouldn't be gangster war. It would be white organized crime attempting to destroy black community. That was far more dangerous to them than any razor. When Bumpy was arrested in 1951 on conspiracy charges and sent to Alcatraz, everyone assumed his empire would crumble. That's how these things worked. The boss goes to prison. The organization fractures. Subordinates fight for control. Everything collapses. It didn't happen. Why? Because Helen Lawson didn't stop working. She couldn't protect him physically. She couldn't stop his prosecution. But she could do something else. She could maintain his legend. While Bumpy was in Alcatraz, Helen wrote essays about Harlem's history, articles about the contributions of black entrepreneurs, pieces that subtly maintained the narrative that Bumpy Johnson was more than just a criminal. He was a protector, a stabilizing force, a man who'd built something that mattered. More importantly, she made sure that the people who needed to know understood that Bumpy was still connected, still influential, still dangerous. When Marcus "Smooth" Henderson, Bumpy's own lieutenant, tried to take over his operation while Bumpy was locked up, something stopped him. Not a direct threat from Bumpy was in prison. But information that flowed to him through Helen, through carefully managed channels, through a network of people who understood that Bumpy's interests were worth protecting. Helen was the conduit. She was the connection between the imprisoned kingpin and the streets that still followed his orders. This was power of a kind that no one had seen before in the criminal underworld. Not supernatural. Not magical. But unprecedented. A woman, operating in the legitimate world, wielding influence on behalf of a man everyone assumed was powerless. When Bumpy was released in 1963 after serving his sentence, the entire Harlem underworld expected weakness. 11 years is a long time. Younger men had risen. New structures had formed. The world had changed. But Bumpy didn't emerge weak. He emerged as a man who'd spent 11 years in prison and somehow maintained control of an empire. How? Helen. She'd written articles about the evolution of organized crime that made clear that Bumpy's approach was more sophisticated than younger, more violent competitors. She'd maintained narrative. She'd kept his legend alive in exactly the way he needed it alive. When Bumpy walked out of Alcatraz and went directly to handle the Marcus Henderson situation, the beating, the scar, the public humiliation, Helen was waiting. Not physically waiting. But she was ready. Within days of the incident at Small's Paradise, a carefully researched article appeared in a small magazine. It discussed the nature of leadership in Harlem. It analyzed different approaches to power. It made clear, without explicitly stating it, that respect-based power, the kind Bumpy represented, was more sustainable than fear-based power, which was what younger gangsters like Henderson represented. The article shaped the narrative. Instead of being seen as a man seeking bloody revenge, Bumpy was seen as a leader restoring order, enforcing legitimate authority. The article helped convince the Italians not to move against him. Here's what the criminal world gradually came to understand about Bumpy Johnson and Helen Lawson's partnership. They couldn't kill her. Not just because it would be wrong, but because it would be strategically catastrophic. Killing Helen Lawson would do something no amount of violence could do. It would turn legitimate power against them. It would convert what was essentially an internal criminal matter into something the mainstream world would have to reckon with. A woman editor murdered by organized crime? That wasn't just news. That was a scandal with legs. That would bring federal attention. That would force politicians to act. So Helen became untouchable. Not through her own power, but through what she represented. She represented the boundary between the criminal world and the legitimate world. She was the proof that Bumpy had access to channels the Italians couldn't reach. Every time she wrote an article, every time her name appeared in a byline, she was making a statement. I'm here. I'm connected. I'm watching. And I have access to mechanisms of power you cannot control. Bumpy understood this perfectly. He also understood something else that made Helen truly powerful. She had nothing to lose in the way that traditional crime associates had something to lose. She wasn't dependent on him for money. She made a good salary at Vanity Fair. She had family wealth. She had alternatives. This made her fundamentally unpredictable in a world where everyone had leverage points. An enforcer can be threatened. A lieutenant can be intimidated. A woman from an elite family with access to legitimate media? What exactly was the threat that would move her? This made her infinitely more dangerous than any bodyguard. By the late 1950s, the underworld understood something fundamental. The rules of power had shifted. It wasn't just about who had the most guns or the most money anymore. It was about who could shape the narrative. Who could access legitimate channels. Who could operate across the boundary between the criminal world and the legitimate world. Helen Lawson had shown that it was possible for someone outside traditional power structures to wield enormous influence. And more importantly, she'd shown that in the modern world, a woman could wield that influence in ways that men couldn't. The sexism of the era actually worked in her favor. The Italian Mafia didn't take female threats seriously. They dismissed Helen as a curious intellectual, a hobby of Bumpy's, an outsider who didn't really matter. They fundamentally underestimated her. And that underestimation was her greatest weapon. While they were focused on Bumpy's street operation, Helen was quietly building narrative. Shaping perception. Making sure that Bumpy's story got told in ways that served his interests. By 1960, every major journalist who covered organized crime knew that Helen Lawson was connected to Bumpy Johnson. Some of them had spoken to her. Some of them understood that if they wanted real insight into how Harlem's underworld functioned, Helen could provide it. She became a source. A trusted source for major newspapers and magazines. And as a source, she had leverage. Journalists would protect her. Not because she asked them to, but because she provided valuable information. Because losing access to her meant losing access to a critical story. In 1968, Bumpy died of a heart attack in the Lenox Lounge, the same place where he'd faced down Big Sam's assassination attempt. Helen outlived him by decades. She lived into the 1990s. She never married again. She continued her career in journalism and publishing. But here's what history got wrong about their relationship. It wasn't a love story. Or rather, it was a love story of a very specific kind. It was the story of two people who understood that in the modern world, power wasn't simple. It wasn't just force. It wasn't just money. Power was narrative. Power was access. Power was the ability to make people listen and believe. Bumpy gave Helen something: security, protection, the ability to operate in a dangerous world without fear. In exchange, Helen gave Bumpy something infinitely more valuable in the modern era. She gave him legitimacy. She gave him access to the machinery of legitimate power. Helen Lawson transformed Bumpy Johnson from a street gangster into a figure who had to be taken seriously. The five families didn't retreat from Harlem simply because Bumpy controlled the streets. Any powerful gangster could do that. They backed down because Bumpy had connections they couldn't sever. Because his story was being carried in mainstream media. Because any move against him would trigger consequences far beyond the criminal underworld. Helen made him untouchable in a way raw force never could. Their partnership reveals something essential about how power actually works in complex societies. Power is not hierarchical. A CEO doesn't possess absolute authority. Neither does a politician, nor a crime boss. Real power is distributed across domains. It requires access, narrative control, and the ability to operate across boundaries others believe are fixed. Helen understood this instinctively. She refused to remain a peripheral figure in Bumpy's world. She would not be reduced to a girlfriend, a muse, or a source of emotional comfort, though she was those as well. She insisted on being an equal. A partner whose intellect, access, and narrative skill were as valuable as Bumpy's grip on the streets. And Bumpy, unlike most men of his era, recognized this. He didn't confine her to a traditional role. He allowed her to operate at the highest level of his organization. The buried photograph was dangerous not because of romance, but because it revealed equality. Two people of different races, genders, and backgrounds standing as peers. That was the real threat to the status quo. Helen Lawson never spoke publicly about her relationship with Bumpy Johnson. This silence was part of her power. No one knew exactly how much influence she wielded, and that uncertainty created mystique. Bumpy, by contrast, understood that being publicly linked to her expanded his authority beyond the underworld. Bumpy Johnson was Harlem's most powerful criminal. But Helen Lawson may have been the most powerful figure in his entire ecosystem, essential, invisible, and decisive. Their story isn't about crime or romance. It's about real power. The kind that endures after the streets change. And it belongs not to those with guns, but to those who control credibility, narrative, and history itself.